Partly that was Ross's, Mr. Ward's request, actually. He was very keen that his story was known, and he was very keen that his story was not anonymous. Obviously, the details of it, the eviction and how that happened, which is how we first got to know Ross back in summer 2018, was a very chaotic and difficult time for everybody. And we think that there's a lot to learn generally, and things that we're still learning at Graih about the case and about how that's been dealt with, and some of the failures in the systems and things like that. So we thought it was important that other people got the chance to reflect on it as well.
Well, what are some of those failures that you think are in the system then that led to this sort of chaotic experience?
I think there were a number of small miscommunications and failures by a number of different sort of statutory bodies, if you like, that led to Ross's eviction. And I think part of the problem is that these systems that we have and these procedures that are in place are often designed by very well-meaning but well-educated people who have no trouble navigating systems, things that you and I would find easy, making appointments, opening letters, and dealing with legal language, all that kind of thing is not necessarily anxiety-provoking for most normal people. But for people who are on the edges, who've got a lot of other problems going on, those things are incomprehensible. And actually, there's something about the systems, if they're too rigid, that means that you lose sight of the person in the middle of it. And I think that's what happened here. There was just some miscommunications that wasn't Ross's fault, is our understanding of it, that led to his build-up of arrears, which eventually led to his eviction. And just throughout that process, although there were opportunities where he was given to participate in the court process, because of his other problems that he had, he found that really difficult to engage with. And that's what leads people to get increasingly isolated, and that's what led to the eviction in the end.
How much, though, is that duty of care on such authorities? If we talk about one example, of course, being Douglas Corporation, which, of course, was eventually the authority that does the evicting. It has the rent arrears in that scenario. How much more that can they do than keep sending out reminders and go through the sort of diligent processes that are in place?
Yes, I mean, that would be a question for the authorities and for the corporation. From our point of view, I mean, we are in a privileged position as a small charity, which we're much more flexible in terms of our policies and procedures and things like that. But we've always found it's just crucial to see vulnerable people at the heart of things, rather than trying to fit them into predetermined boxes or procedures, because they won't. There's no procedure that we can come up with that will cover everybody. There'll always be exceptions, and there'll always be people who are falling through the cracks, and there needs to be a flexibility there to see the people at the heart of the process and the procedures. And I think all statutory bodies, in my experience, can sometimes really struggle with that. I mean, particularly big ones, you have to obviously have the organisation and the policies and procedures there, but there has to be a focus of when there's a little bit of flexibility needed. I mean,
it's a blurred line, though, isn't it? Because that veers into social work.
Well, it does, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's partly about making connections as well. And part of this, I mean, we've sat down with the council and had a few conversations with them, obviously, over the past number of months. And it's about making connections with the support that is there. There's a lot of other, not only Graih, but Housing Matters and other health and social care bodies who would be happy to support individuals like Ross in these sorts of situations. I think partly there was a data protection thing about if people aren't consenting to having their data shared with somebody else, even if the housing authorities feel that they are in difficulty of some sort, if they can't get consent to say, can we not ring Graih or can we not ring Housing Matters, there was a sense that some of the data protection rules might have sort of been difficult in that. From our point of view, again, whatever the processes and procedures are, whatever the legislation is, whether it's data protection or not, it's so easy for vulnerable people to get squeezed out and to suffer. And that's Ross's case is unfortunately a tragic and classic case of that happening, where if there had been early intervention, if people had been involved from an earlier stage, a lot of this could hopefully have been diverted and not happened.
Well, from your involvement with Ross's story, how did that come about? Was that because he approached you, or was he signposted to you by the corporation or someone else?
He first came to our attention in the summer of 2018, just after he'd been evicted, and he'd been rough sleeping for a night or two when he accessed our drop-in for some accommodation and some support. I think it was Housing Matters who he'd had some contact with, and they'd made him aware that the drop-in was available for him. So that was the start of our relationship with him. And the eviction process, he had been evicted, but we hadn't managed to get his stuff out of his old flat at that point, so we were able to help with some of that. And it was...
Sorry, at that point though, would that be when you would like, say, Douglas Corporation or some local authority, when they know they're at eviction stage, is that when people should be pointing people to you?
Well, ideally much earlier than that, actually, because if we'd known, if anybody had known about the difficulties that Ross was facing months and months earlier, while there was an ongoing court process, the court process had all finished by the time we had first contact with him. So that court decision has been made. He's been evicted. It's happened. There's nothing we can do about that at that stage. So, in a sense, the horse has bolted and we're just picking up some pieces. What's really valuable is obviously it's in everybody's interests, all the statutory bodies and the housing authorities, to avoid evictions. They're costly, they're difficult processes, they're tragic for the individuals involved as well. And if there's just a little bit of support that can be put in place before people get to that eviction point, then I think that can help a lot of things going on. If we had been with Ross 6 months earlier, I'm sure that we would have been able to divert the eviction.
With that case, though, I mean, if all these letters and reminders are going unnoticed by the person in question, then couldn't signposts or pointing to charities like yourselves also go unnoticed?
Yes, it could. And I mean, I'm under no illusion that for particularly vulnerable tenants, it's a really difficult job that the housing officers have in how best to support them, how best to communicate with them. I'm not going to say that there are really easy answers to any of that. I think there are always going to be situations where people fall through the cracks. I think what's important is that all of us who are involved with people to any degree, statutory or third sector or the general community, is that we understand so much more about the vulnerabilities of people and just the most effective ways of communicating with them. It's not enough to just send a letter out to people and then say, well, they've had all the information, it's there in their court. When you've got a load of mental ill health problems and physical health problems, a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion, a lot of communication difficulties, it just takes a lot more time and gentleness to have effective communication with them. Communication is a two-way thing. It's not a sense of, we can just send something out and then we've communicated with people. It has to be a two-way process, and that's particularly the case with people who are more vulnerable and maybe need a bit of extra support to understand the implications of what's going on and support through that process.
So in its simplest terms, a house visit.
I think visiting is always good, and I think people are always better to speak to face to face. You can get a much more of a feel for people, and certainly in our experience, many of the vulnerable adults we see maybe struggle with literacy, maybe struggle with understanding, written communication, often very anxious about phone calls even. But if you can sit down with them face to face in a non-threatening way, that often aids communication a great deal.
How reflective do you think Ross's story is of other goings on? Is it a wide problem? Is it rare?
I mean, I think this is the first time that in Graih's experience that we've had a particular case that's just like this, if you like. But what I do know is that we have contact throughout the year, every day, with a wide variety of vulnerable adults who are struggling often with housing in lots of different ways. Mostly they're tenants in private rented sectors rather than public sector rented rentals, but I think it is reflective of the difficulties of communication and the difficulties of effectively supporting people in tenancies, but also how effective it is to provide a bit of support within tenancies, public or private, that stop people deteriorating to such a position where they're getting evicted, where they're sleeping rough, where they're having to drag their possessions out of a skip in full view of passing traffic. Those are situations that it's in no one's interests to have on the Isle of Man in 2019 and going forward. And so I think anything that we can do generally to support the vulnerable in our community is really key. Is there anything else you wanted to add at all? I'd just like to add actually that I know there's been a lot of talk about the legal process and some of the legal things around this case, an eviction. And I know that in Ross's case in particular, Hannah and Law have been fantastic. When we first got them involved, Ross was very keen to have legal representation, and they got involved back in the autumn of 2018, and they've been fantastic in supporting Ross throughout the process that was ongoing at the time of his death. And so again, I think there's something about accessing help and support that he would not have done that on his own. He needed support to access the legal aid that was there. And again, I think that's reflective of our systems in that we can say there's a lot of support on for people, but unless they're actually enabled to access it, and sometimes that means going with them and attending appointments, and that's time consuming and laborious for people involved in supporting them, but that's what gets access to justice, and that's what gets access to the help that is there and the systems that we as a society have put in place for the most vulnerable. And it's that access thing that's really crucial.